great British poet William Blake once wrote, "It is easier to forgive an enemy than it is to forgive a friend." When an enemy hurts us, we can understand. An enemy's desire is to see us suffer. But when a friend hurts us, or says something negative about us, or offends us, that is when forgiveness is truly tested. Because when a friend hurts us, we are left face to face with the question of why and the sense of betrayal. 2 Corinthians is a letter that deals with betrayal, the question why, and ultimately redemption. When we finished 1 Corinthians, the church in Corinth seemed to be in a good place. Paul wrote that letter in response to several problems he heard the church was having. But what most people don't know is that 1 Corinthians actually made the situation in Corinth worse. Things got so bad, in fact, that Paul boarded a ship and decided he was going to visit the Corinthians personally. Paul figured that if he could see the Corinthians face to face, he was sure that he could work something out and smooth things over. But Paul's visit made things worse, a lot worse. When Paul arrived in Corinth, he found that the church that he loved had turned on him. Now, it's easy for us to hear this 2,000 years later and think, okay, well, that's too bad. But imagine what this felt like for Paul. Paul was a real human being with real human emotions. And this church that he had planted and grown had turned on him and questioned whether he was worthy enough to preach about Jesus Christ. The church was not a building to Paul. The church was people. Brothers and sisters who Paul had celebrated in their weddings with. Brothers and sisters who had cried on Paul's shoulders during tragedies. And brothers and sisters who had given their fragile newborns to Paul as they said, "Isn't she perfect?" It was these people who all of a sudden began to question whether Paul was worthy to be a teacher on who Jesus Christ was. The Corinthians had three major concerns about Paul. The first concern was that Paul seemed to be very adventurous and daring and bold in the letters that he wrote. But when they saw Paul in person, he didn't really match the tone in his letters. They often thought of Paul as weak and undetermined and even ugly. The Corinthians wanted a champion. They wanted someone they could look up to. They wanted somebody they could be proud to call their teacher, and they got Paul instead. Some of the earliest writings about Paul's physical appearance describe Paul as a short, stocky, balding man with a hooked nose and even, get this, a unibrow. In other words, the Corinthians were quite a shallow people. The second major concern the Corinthians had was that Paul didn't have any official letters of recommendation from, well, anyone. Paul, they claimed, was a teacher of just experience, not a teacher of status or a teacher that had any kind of title that they could look up to. The Corinthians were demanding that Paul bring forth some sort of letter of recommendation that showed that he was an official teacher with an official title. Lastly, the third concern that the Corinthians had of Paul was that he continually refused any financial compensation for his teaching. Now, this may not seem like a big deal, but the Greeks believed that all free men should not work with their hands. That was work that was reserved for slaves. Because of this, traveling teachers or philosophers similar to Paul would often charge for their teachings to subsidize their living. Paul, in order to prove that he was not teaching Jesus Christ for any sort of financial gain, refused all payments from any church he was currently pastoring. To subsidize his life, Paul made and sold tents to the people that he interacted with. The Greeks saw this and they criticized Paul. They said, "Why are we listening to someone who acts more like a slave rather than like a free man?" The Corinthians took this criticism one step further. If Paul refused to charge for his teachings, well, maybe then his teachings weren't worth anything at all. With these three criticisms fresh in his mind, Paul left Corinth with a heavy heart. This visit was painful to Paul because the Corinthians, this beloved church, questioned Paul's motives. Paul returned to Ephesus and decided to give the Corinthians a piece of his mind. He wrote a letter that was full of rebuke, anger, and ultimately discipline. Paul finished this letter, known as the Severe Letter, and he sent it with his messenger Titus and told him to deliver it to the people of Corinth. Immediately after sending this letter, Paul became anxious. It was like he wrote an email and regretted pushing send. He was nervous about the harsh, judgmental tone of the letter. Paul grew so anxious, he became so stressed out that he actually took off after Titus, hoping to catch Titus on his way back from Corinth. Eventually, Paul meets up with him in Macedonia, and he nervously asks Titus what was the reception of the Corinthians to his harsh, severe letter. At this moment, Titus shares with Paul that they have great concern and great love for Paul, and they are worried sick about how Paul is doing. Paul is immediately relieved. And because of this, he sits down in Macedonia to write a second letter to the Corinthians. This letter that we know today as 2 Corinthians. This letter is a letter for those who have been betrayed, who have been disheartened, and who ultimately seek reconciliation. As we read through 2 Corinthians, we find that the book is divided into 3 distinct sections. The first 7 chapters of 2 Corinthians deal with the 3 main criticisms that Paul received on his last visit. However, Paul deals with these criticisms in the light of reconciliation. The last thing Paul wants to do is to cause more strife or anger or division based on these criticisms. Oddly enough, the next 2 chapters in 2 Corinthians deal with finances. At some point, the Corinthians pledged to help the mother church of Christianity in Jerusalem. Paul wants all the money to be collected before he arrives in Corinth for the second time. He wants this to happen so that way when they get together, they can focus on reconciliation and there is no agenda, nothing to be done, everything is already taken care of. The last section of 2 Corinthians deals specifically with the criticism of accreditation. Paul shares his credentials with the Corinthians, but they are unlike any credentials the Corinthians had ever heard of before. Paul, in these upside-down credentials, shares what it is like to follow Jesus Christ, not the ways of the world, and what that actually looks like. Throughout this entire letter, Paul remains vulnerable. We can feel the anxiety and the nervousness weigh on Paul as he writes each word. This is a letter for those who have been betrayed, for those who have been disheartened, for those who have felt alone, for those struggling with the question of why. And in this letter, we find Paul, who is filled with hope, grace, peace, and love as he desperately seeks reconciliation. We hope you enjoy 2 Corinthians.